I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. So let's just dive in. All right, just a real quick outline. So first I'm going to talk about what everybody's probably wanting to hear the most, and that has to do with the stay of the Clean Power Plan last week. And then I'm just going to give a little bit of background about the Clean Power Plan, some important timelines, talk a little bit about potentially affected sources, how we developed our best system of emission reduction, some state goals, including how the Wyoming goal came about, and then a little bit about our proposed federal plan and model rule. So the stay happened last week by the Supreme Court, and what does this mean? So it means that implementation and enforcement of the Clean Power Plan on hold. And first and foremost, that means that the states will not be required to submit either their final plan or their request for an extension, which we refer to as an initial submittal. Those were due September 6th of this year, and the states were working on those already. They will not be required to do that. What is going to happen to all the subsequent deadlines after that is still unknown. But EPA has committed to continue working with states that want to move forward with the development of their plans or to move forward with carbon reductions in their states. And what that means is we'll be available to them upon request. We'll be providing them with tools and resources as necessary. And some of those tools and resources might include the development of our online reporting system, what we call SPECS. It might include the guidance that we're putting together on the Clean Energy Incentive Program. I think you can appreciate that we're still trying to analyze what this all means and what we're able to really move forward on. So just some timelines around all this. So in August, we proposed the final Clean Power Plan, we signed, the final Clean Power Plan, and proposed a federal plan and a model rule, and I'll talk about those later in the presentation. The final Clean Power Plan was published in the Federal Register on October 23rd, and that opened the door for the states to apply for a motion for stay with the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which they did. I understand it was a 27-state group that submitted a consolidated motion, and it was denied on January 21st by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The states then turned around and submitted the stay request to the Supreme Court, who granted the stay last week on February 9th. Now, it will go to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and they had already set an expedited schedule to hear arguments, and all the arguments have been consolidated into one case. The briefs are due in April, I understand, and so on June 2nd and maybe even on June 3rd, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals will hear those arguments. What happens after that is a big unknown. Could potentially go back to the Supreme Court, and the EPA and both sides will be arguing the merits of the case before both the DC Circuit Court of Appeals and then potentially the Supreme Court. So the end date of all of this is really unknown. What we're confident of is that it will be settled before the first compliance period for the Clean Power Plan is set to begin, which is in 2022. So I'm just going to, like I said in my outline, I'm going to give you just some background information on the Clean Power Plan. This is for informational purposes only. I just want to really make the point that this does not obligate the states to do anything moving forward until we get some resolution in the courts. So here are some timelines. I mentioned the September 6, 2016 deadline. That was for states to submit either their final plan, and there were a couple states that were going to do that, California being one of them. Most states, we understand, were going to submit what we call an initial submittal and ask for a 2-year extension. So they would have had until September 6, 2018 to submit their final plan. I mentioned the compliance period starting in 2022. It runs through 2029. In 2029, there are what we call interim goals, and then in 2030, there are final goals that would have to be met. And along the way, there were some interim step periods where the states would have to demonstrate how they're moving forward with compliance under their plan. This is a map that shows the potentially affected sources under the Clean Power Plan. The fossil steam units, meaning the coal or the oil units, those are in blue, and the NGCC units, the natural gas combined cycle units, are in yellow. And there's about 3,000 of them across the country. And they have to be grid connected, and they're generally around 25 megawatts and larger. I want to show the 3 electricity interconnects in the country because EPA relied on this in setting what we call the best system of emission reduction that is required under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act that EPA used to develop the Clean Power Plan. And you can see the western states, for the most part, are covered in the orange area, the eastern states in the yellow area, and then Texas has its own area in the green. So in setting the best system of emission reduction, we developed what we call building blocks. In the proposed rule, some of you may have heard Joe Goffman's presentation last year. There were 4 building blocks at that time. We narrowed it down to 3 different building blocks. And the first one is heat rate improvements at affected coal-fired facilities. And we looked at the operation of 884 coal-fired units around the country between 2002 and 2012, and looked at what heat rate improvements were being achieved. For the western states, we came up with a number of 2.1% heat rate improvement as a feasible number moving forward for facilities. And that seems somewhat consistent with what we've heard from the utilities, at least in our states anyway, as what might be reasonable to achieve moving forward. So what this building block does is it has the effect of reducing CO2 emission rates from facilities, as well as reducing their CO2 emissions. Building block 2 is shifting fossil steam generation, those are the coal and oil units, to the natural gas combined cycle units, and this is up to 75% of net summer capacity. This building block, often referred to as redispatch, has the effect of lowering fossil steam generation and increasing natural gas combined cycle generation. The third building block is shifting fossil steam generation and NGCC generation to renewable energy generation. And we based our analysis on a couple different things. One is actual deployment for the period of time in which we had the latest data. So we looked at the period of time between 2010 and 2014. We looked at actual deployment data across the country. But we also looked at renewable energy potential. And those numbers were based on analyses by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we focused on 5 different sectors, concentrating solar, PV, utility scale, PV, onshore wind, hydropower, and geothermal. This building block has the effect of lowering fossil steam and NGCC generation and increasing renewable energy generation. So then we took these building blocks and we applied them to the affected facilities that I showed you before on the map to come up with what we call CO2 emission performance rates for the 3 electricity interconnects in the country. And you can see what those numbers are. We chose the least stringent one, which happened to be for the eastern region. So there's a fossil steam rate of 1,305 pounds per megawatt hour and an NGCC rate of 771 pounds per megawatt hour. And we chose that least stringent number to make sure that affected facilities across the country would be able to achieve this reasonably. We then use those CO2 emission performance rates to set the state goals. And it really depends on the number of the different types of facilities that a state might have. So we took the emission performance rates, multiplied it by the percent of generation type to come up with a unique state goal. And then we then translated that unique state goal in pounds per megawatt hour into a mass-based goal in pounds of CO2. So for the state of Wyoming, on the bottom you can see, now for Wyoming they have 99% coal units and 1% natural gas units. So we took the 1,305 pounds per megawatt hour times 99%. And then we took the 771 pounds per megawatt hour times 1% and added together those became the Wyoming state goal of 1,299 pounds per megawatt hour, and that translated into their mass goal of 31,634,412 tons of CO2. Those are 2030 numbers that they have to meet. Like I mentioned before, there are interim goals that are less stringent. I want to mention that Wyoming's goal It happens to be one of the least stringent in the country. That said, it still represents a 44% reduction from their 2012 levels, so it's certainly not insignificant. EPA included in the final Clean Power Plan some trading mechanisms that the states can use, and there's a couple different mechanisms I'd like to just talk about. So for rate-based plans, a state or a utility would have the option of trading what we call emission rate credits, or ERCs. And ERCs equal 1 megawatt hour of zero emitting energy generation. So that could be some of the things I mentioned before, concentrating solar PV, concentrating solar, utility scale PV. It could be distributed solar. It could be onshore and offshore wind. It could be energy efficiency. And on and on. So there's a lot of different options for generating ERCs. And qualified projects would be eligible to obtain an ERC and trade it throughout the compliance periods. Under a mass-based plan, allowances would be issued and traded. And an allowance, sorry, I want to go back. There was one other thing. There are other ways to generate ERCs. So, for example, an ERC, a partial ERC, could be generated by, let's say, a coal-fired facility that operates at a rate lower than its requirement by the state. So there's other ways that ERCs can be generated that wouldn't be considered necessarily zero emitting energy generation. So moving back onto the mass-based plans and the allowances. So an allowance is permission to emit 1 ton of CO2, and allowances can be traded amongst states or utilities. So that was the second type, but I want to point out that EPA has offered to run the tracking system for issuing and trading ERCs and allowances. But the states also have the option of developing their own trading system should they choose to do that. We also issued a proposed model rule back in August when the final Clean Power Plan was signed that gives the states kind of a clear path forward, an easily adoptable plan for moving forward should a state decide to adopt EPA's either rate-based or mass-based model trading rule. It would be presumptively approvable by the EPA. So let's just talk a little bit about how rate-based trading would work. So a unit would have an emission rate that they would have to meet. They could either meet that actually, or they could use that, or they could bring in ERCs to help them with an adjusted emission rate. That adjusted emission rate would have to equal the emission rate standard that has been set for that particular state or that particular facility, depending on how the state wants to design their state plan. The formula in the upper right-hand corner is how this particular unit would demonstrate compliance. So their adjusted emission rate would be their CO2 that was emitted during the compliance period, divided by the megawatt hours of their actual generation, plus any ERCs in megawatt hours that they may have obtained or that they may be holding. Under a mass-based trading approach, the units would measure and report their actual CO2 emissions. They can use allowances to help them meet the CO2 rate that has been set either for the state as a whole or for that particular facility. There are some other CO2 reduction opportunities that I didn't mention, and I just want to point out a few of them. Fuel switching is another opportunity, combined heat and power, certain types of new biomass. And when I say that biomass, renewable energy, and nuclear energy will count towards compliance, that has to be what we call incremental generation. So it has to be new generation post-2012 for it to be eligible for a state to use, and it has to be still generating within the compliance periods. Carbon capture and utilization and potentially carbon capture and sequestration are also options that the states would have to achieve compliance. There are some state plan types. There's a lot of flexibility built into the final Clean Power Plan, so the states have some options in terms of developing their state plans. There's what's called an emission standards plan, so that could be just applying the CO2 emission performance rates to all the units in the state. It could be having a state rate-based or a mass-based goal that all the facilities would have to meet on average. or it could be varied CO2 emission rates that the state may decide to assign to different units. Under a state measures plan, the state would be meeting their mass-based goal, but then they could include other measures, like a renewable portfolio standard, for example, into their state plan. It wouldn't be federally enforceable. It would only be enforceable by the state, but it would be acceptable. I want to talk a little bit about the Clean Energy Incentive Program. And what that is just it's a voluntary program for the states, and it's really designed to incentivize early investments in wind and solar and energy efficiency in low-income communities. And so the states would allocate ERCs or allowances to these eligible projects, and EPA would match those projects with ERCs and allowances. And our matching is capped at 300 million short tons of CO2 nationally, and that would be divided up amongst the states that choose to participate in this program. Eligible projects would have to commence construction or operation if they're an energy efficiency project after submission of a state final plan. And then it would have to generate results during the 2020 and or 2020 timeframe. The dates around those now are up in the air, given the stay on the Clean Power Plan. So we're not really sure how that's going to play out, as well as all the other compliance dates within the Clean Power Plan. I understand in the past there are a couple instances where settlements have been reached within the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and then subsequently the court then adjusted the dates for compliance under those particular rules. So we might expect that to happen again here. So we really can't say what compliance dates or what the dates around this particular program might be moving forward if the Clean Power Plan is upheld in the courts. So for wind and solar projects, for every 2 megawatt hours of renewable energy, one state ERC or allowance would be issued, and then one EPA ERC or allowance would be matched. But it's double that for energy efficiency in low-income communities. There were some reliability features in the final Clean Power Plan that I wanted to mention. We received a lot of comments from folks who were concerned about reliability moving forward under the Clean Power Plan. And so we built in a few things that we felt might address that. So the flexible state plan designs is one of those. Like I said, the states really have a lot of flexibility in terms of how they design their plans. So hopefully one of those plan types moving forward will be the best approach for a particular state in terms of maintaining reliability moving forward. There's a requirement that the states demonstrate consideration of reliability in terms of working with a reliability organization to look at their state plan and evaluate it potentially through modeling. There's a state plan revision mechanism, so if the state doesn't feel like reliability, if the state feels like it's having reliability issues, it can come to EPA and mention that with us, and they would have the option then to do some state plan revisions. There's also what's called a reliability safety valve for emergency situations. So if a particular facility had to increase its emissions for a period of time because another facility had to shut down, let's say due to an extreme weather event, they would have that option to do that for a number of months. And EPA is also committed to coordinate with DOE and with FERC moving forward to continue to evaluate reliability in both the production and the transmission systems to ensure that reliability was being met. So just very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the proposed federal plan and model rule. So a federal plan is a plan that EPA would apply to states or tribes that don't submit an approvable plan under a certain timeline. And the model rule is, like I mentioned before, an example plan that EPA developed that states or tribes can just take on as their own plan. And there's two different types of model trading rules, a rate-based and a mass-based, and there's two different types of federal plans, a rate-based and a mass-based. But EPA would finalize only one single approach for the states in which it would move forward with a federal plan, either a rate-based or a mass-based, so there was consistency around the country. For the mass-based plans, units would meet a mass-based limit in tons, and they would comply by holding allowances. For a rate-based plan, the units would meet a rate-based limit in pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour, and they would comply using ERCs. And that's really all I have. This is my last slide. I just want to mention that on our Clean Power Plan website, there's a lot of resources available for states and communities and tribes and folks like yourselves. So I would encourage you to go there. There's a state goal visualizer. If you didn't quite understand how the state goals were put together, you could go in and look at how any particular state's goals were developed, and it just walks you step by step through the calculation. All our technical support documents are there if you decide to really dig into it and get some more information. So there's a lot there. I encourage you to do that, and I'm assuming you'll be sharing the slides with folks, so you'll have this as a resource. Thank you.